This is the first in a series of videos on the history of the patent boards of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The videos are a project of the American Association of Patent Judges. On this video, we have three former administrative patent judges, Bruce Stoner, Gary Harkcom, and myself, Richard Schafer. Our comments on this video are unscripted. Each of us were vice chiefs under Chief Judge Fred McKelvey. By way of introduction, each of us will provide a brief description of our backgrounds and how and when we came to the board. So, Bruce, go ahead.
Thanks, Rick. I came to the board in 1986. I was appointed at a time when the board had determined that it needed to expand. There were, I'm not quite sure how many there were at the time when we came aboard. There may have been 25 APJs. There were 6 of us appointed at one time. The board was located in Crystal Gateway at that time, and so was the solicitor's office. And so it was in 1986 or thereabouts that I first met Fred McKelvey. My background was mechanical engineering. I had been a supervisor in the PTO for several years. I've been in the office 16 years when I came to the board. So my acquaintance with Fred goes back to 1986. The acquaintance deepened significantly after that time. But in terms of just a simple introduction, why don't we go and pass it along now to Gary?
Well, my getting to the board was more indirect. When I went to college for electrical engineering, it was during the Vietnam War, and the school I went to had mandatory ROTC for the Air Force for every male for 2 years. They offered me a scholarship to pay my way through school if I would agree to become an Air Force officer for at least 4 years. During the next 9 years that I was in the Air Force, they sent me to a master's degree in management. And so I made my way to the patent office in 1981, where I was an examiner, and I was going to law school at night because I wanted to get a law degree. So then I was an examiner, became a primary examiner for 1 year, and then I was a supervisory patent examiner for 7 years. And I was selected to the board in 1994. And that's about when I met Fred, because he hired me. And I was at the board, after 1 year at 95, I became one of the 3 vice chief judges. And I stayed at the board as a vice chief judge and eventually 2 years as an acting chief judge until I retired in 2008.
Okay, I came to the office in 1970 and was a patent examiner. In 1980, I became a supervisory patent examiner. And after 4 years in that, I moved to the solicitor's office, where I became an associate solicitor until 94. During the time as both a supervisory examiner and, of course, the solicitor's office, I had gotten to know Fred McKelvey. And Fred had come in, and he had needed one of my examiners to be an expert witness in a case in the district court in DC. And that's where I really got to know Fred. And then ultimately he brought me over to the solicitor's office as an associate solicitor. And I was there until 94 when I came to the board. I came to the board, I think, the same day that Gary came to the board.
I think so.
And then in 95, along with Gary and Bruce, Fred selected us as vice chief judges at that time. And I stayed, I think I was vice chief judge for about 2 years, around about 2 years, maybe 3 years. But then I stayed in the board until I retired in at the beginning of 2018. So I mentioned Fred McKelvey, and Fred was a really important person in the PTO, to the office, to the patent boards, to both patent boards at the time, and as to our individual careers in the office. Before being appointed chief judge, Fred had many jobs in the office. He was on both boards. He was on the board of patent interferences. He was on the board of appeals. He was deputy solicitor of the patent office and solicitor of the patent office. He was appointed to the board. Maybe Bruce can fill in a little bit more about this, but he came to the board when I think Bruce Lehman was then commissioner of patents, and Bruce had moved Fred over to the board, which to institute a number of changes.
Yeah, Rick, if I might, I think the people who are listening to this today are all conscious of this fact, but those who might view this in the future may not be. We were formerly, the members of the board were formerly known as examiners in chief, a title that went back, I understand, almost 100 years before, but we were by statute occupying a position known as examiner in chief. In October, I did some research, went back to my records, and I see that on October 4th, 1993, the members of the board were all authorized to use the title of administrative patent judge in your official capacity as examiner in chief. And that was for all purposes, signing of correspondence and decisions, official correspondence, business cards, other business-related activities. There are several interesting things about that memo. It helped me recapture the numbers that were involved at the board at that time. There were 44 addressees of that memo. And the timing is important here, October 4th, 1993. Saul and Ian were the ranking chairman and vice chairman of the board. They then assumed the titles of chief administrative patent judge and vice chief administrative patent judge. And then there were an additional 42 names of judges who appeared on that memo. Fred came to the board, as I recall, in early 94. Saul retired at the end of 93, beginning of 94. Fred came to the board in 94. And there was, in fact, I suppose, an intention to have a culture change. And there was. Saul left, and based on a memo from 1995, and we have discussed this, May 5th, 1995 was actually May 1st, 1995 is when the three of us became vice chiefs to Fred. And when I look at the list of bodies that were present on May 5th, 1995, there were 44 authorized positions, just as there had been when Saul left in end of 93 and Fred came in beginning of 1994. One of those positions was vacant, so there were 43 bodies, including Fred. When I looked down over that list, it revealed that in addition to Saul, there had been another 12 retirements. 12 people left, and there were 12 new people added to the list, including Rick and Gary and a series of other APJs. So by its very nature, that's going to create a culture change. it's always been the case that the board has had turnover. It was that way, I think, throughout the time I was there. We have some other numbers that may give some indications of how that happened, or the numbers. But I think Gary said that his records show that there were 70 APJs when
I left, there were 70.
yeah. When I left, I think the number was 61 APJs. And of those, when I looked, it looked to me like 29 of those were new to the board from the time of those 44 names that I referenced on the May 5th, 1995 amendment. So there were a lot of people out and 29 new in, and given that the number of judges didn't increase dramatically, I guess it increased by 17, that meant that there were an additional 29 new bodies. So there must have been 17 out and 29 in that time frame. Anyhow, it gives you some kind of a flavor for what the timing was and the rest of it. When we had a chance to talk earlier, we talked about meetings with Fred. And the way we became vice chiefs, I thought was kind of interesting. But I'll just say, from the perspective of the folks who were on the board when he came in '94, we were all invited over to have a meeting with Fred. Sit down, discuss what we thought about the board, what we thought about whatever happened to be on our minds at that time. Because there had been a certain amount of turmoil with a number of APJs leaving. And that was everybody's who was currently on the board meeting with Fred, even though we had shared a space with the solicitor's office from '86 to about '93, sometime in there, and I'm sure Rick knows this better than I do. The solicitor's office moved back to closer to the director's office over in that part of Crystal City, further south in Crystal City. So when we had those meetings with Fred, we all kind of made the journey down to the other end of the campus to have a meeting. And meeting with Fred in his office, especially if you didn't know him very well, was a slightly intimidating situation, because Fred was really well known around the office. Fred was, I used to describe these people as the owners. There were people like Mike Kirk and Rennie Tegmeyer and several others who were the gray eminences around the office. They were the ones who knew how things worked and could make the system work very well. They were the people who carried over from administration to administration, and they were viewed as smart, wise, and powerful. And nobody ever wanted to get any of those people's bad side. I've spoken enough. I think some other people need to speak up.
Well, from my perspective, talking about Fred and him being chief judge, in my experience, and which was 47 years in the patent office, there were two chief judges that were exceptional, and maybe one commissioner was exceptional, I thought. But and probably a lot of that time I didn't know enough to judge the quality of anybody. But Fred was, with his knowledge, which he seemed to know everything. He always came and talked about, the latest Supreme Court cases, even if they weren't patent law or intellectual property, if they were on procedure. he would come in, or he'd say, "Oh, there's this new procedural case at the district court DC." He was always on top of everything, and he was one of the most respected people in the patent office. And Fred was instrumental. I don't think Fred ever liked the fact that the board was, well, at first the solicitor's office was out there in Crystal Gateway, where we were, which was at the far end of Crystal City. And so he moved us a couple of times. He moved us to Crystal Plaza 2, I believe, for a while, so he could be closer to where the real power was. And then ultimately he moved us to one floor down from the commissioner. And he moved us into Crystal Park, I guess it was at that time. But he just had so much clout with people, but he also had the insights that really convinced people that how things should be. And his focus was always one thing that made him really great, in my view, was his focus was always on the agency mission. The agency mission and what the Patent and Trademark Office did for the country. And he was never out to make a name for himself. He got a name because he did his job. He did it well. He brought in great people to work with him and other places in the agency. And it was just always a pleasure to work with him. And it was such a confidence builder to have to work closely with somebody with his knowledge and his capabilities.
My getting to know Fred was a little different. I didn't know Fred before I was selected to the board, other than by name. So before he retired in '95, there was 1 year where it so happened that he and I commuted the same train to the office. So that was a time when the biggest issue, which is pretty much still is today, was the patentability of the statutory nature of 101, computer-related inventions. So every time on the train, Fred would want to bring up a new case, and we would talk about all the 101 issues. So that's when I got to know Fred pretty well.
One thing I might mention at this point, just Bruce mentioned that we were examiners in chief before we were administrative patent judges. But the board itself went through at least a lot of name changes. For most of the board's history, there were two boards. There was an appeals board and there was an interference board. And it started out, there was the board of examiners in chief, and that ultimately became the board of appeals. And there was also the board of interference examiners, who then became the board of interferences. And then I guess it was in '84 that the two boards got combined into the Board of Patent Appeals and Interferences. And then in 2011, the legislation for the PTAB was formed, and while interferences and appeals continued, a lot of additional duties, as everyone knows, were added to the board's responsibilities. So I guess we've talked about about Fred was as a chief APJ. During the time that the three of us were vice chiefs, and then at the time when Bruce became chief judge, there was there was a growing backlog of appeals and both interferences, and Bruce in particular was instrumental in coming up with plans with Fred to address those backlogs. So over to Bruce.
Yeah, that's a good topic. I wanted to focus, before we move to that, very briefly on the fact that We became vice chiefs together on May 1st, 1995, and Fred retired for the first time on September 30th, 1995. Fred had a history of being at the office, going outside for a brief period of time, and returning. I always was grateful when Fred returned, because it was the kind of advice that you could get from very few other kind of people. Rick and Gary were both wise and provided sage advice, but if you needed the advice that extended over a long period of time, and knowing ways to influence the powers that be, there was nobody quite like Fred. So Fred had some good influence. Fred had in 1984, 83, 84, when the new board structure was created, when the two boards were merged, he wrote rules that were intended to make interferences move more quickly. In the old days, interferences seemed to drag on forever. And Fred wrote a set of rules that I remember reading as a young examiner, that I was quite impressed with. It sounded like interferences ought to go really quickly, and it even provided a timeline as to how these things would go. But in practice, when I was at the board as first examiner in chief, and I wasn't doing interferences, although I was involved in several of them from time to time, the reputation was that these things went on forever, and in fact, they did go on forever. They were some of the most long-running proceedings in the PTO. There came a time when we had not only a backlog of ex parte appeals, but we had a large stack of interferences, and the interference bar was starting to become somewhat noisy about the fact that these things weren't getting done. And I discussed the matter with Fred, as well as with other experienced interference APJs who had operated under the other system, where there were interlocutory examiners who spent virtually all their time doing interlocutory work, and then the system as it was. And it became clear we had to do something. And there was really a choice of two ways to go. And of course, being the kind of person who can't just choose between two, I chose the third way. One way would have been to return to the old-fashioned way. The second way would have been to follow the rules as Fred wrote them. And yet I knew that that was not going to be a popular decision. I didn't try to govern myself by popular decisions, but it was evident that if we combined the two approaches, people doing those interferences they had just the way they had in the past, unless it was a related interference, and then those folks would not declare new interferences. And the rest of the board was organized, the rest of the interference folks were organized into an organization we called the Interference Trial Section, with Fred as the center of gravity. I don't think there was any question. It wasn't that he was the chief there, but he was the first among equals in that particular organization. That organization within the board followed those precepts that Fred had laid down when he rewrote the rules in '84. And the rest of that is history. That process worked very, very well. The number of pending interferences declined dramatically by following the kind of procedures that Fred had outlined back in '84, and by adding to that kind of the rocket docket model that was being followed in the Eastern District of Virginia at that point under Judge Ellis. It was a very positive outcome. The bar seemed to actually love it. They didn't have to go back and restart all those other interferences and walk them through under new circumstances. But all the interferences declared after that date of the organization of the trial section were under the new procedure. And the upshot of that was all the interferences got done in a rather expeditious fashion. Well, we can talk a little bit later about some of the statistics, but the process was that it worked, and using that third path seemed to be the key to getting this done with ruffling the fewest number of feathers. The APJs who wanted to do it the old way didn't have to change. The APJs who wanted to do it the new way were able to do so, and the bar seemed to be happy with the outcome. One really good piece of advice I had gotten from an APJ years before was no interference gets over unless it's first declared. And so it became important for us to get those things declared promptly. And once that started to happen with the new procedures in place, it worked very well.
Yeah, we started when the interference trial section started. It was Fred, and then there were two APJs, and over time, as we declared more interferences, more APJs were brought in. Mostly, almost, yeah, I guess exclusively newer APJs that had been recently hired that we brought in. Also, we made some procedural changes. I mean. It used to be that there were in interferences, an examiner would recommend that an interference be declared, and they'd come up to the board, and sometimes they'd sit for years, it would seem, that nothing would happen with them. And then even when they were declared, the APJ might say, well, you're entitled to the priority of an earlier application, but then somebody had to get that application, and that often took some time. And through just procedures, working with the examining corps, we were able to straighten that out so that the interferences wouldn't come to us unless all the applications, all the priority applications were there. So we had everything. And that seemed to help move things along. I think also if an examiner had a request on their docket for an interference be declared, it actually went on a list that the examiner had. It actually went on as a docket item. So the examiners had to move it, and then with the requirement that they get all the priority applications. We had everything, the board had everything it needed to move ahead, and the attorneys could get the copies of the applications they needed. So also particularly during Bruce's time as chief judge, and subsequently, the board had a lot of challenges in growing and adding people, and there were changes both we talked about interferences. There were also some changes in ex parte prosecution or ex parte appeals or proposed changes, and those seem to work fairly well also. So there were Bruce and Gary, you guys I know worked a lot in this, but the changing demographics of the board from mid 80s to through the mid 2000s or around 2005. So what kind of things did we have to change then?
One thing, since as you hear about, like Rick was so deeply involved in interferences and Bruce was also, I was focusing on appeals. Now, one of the things that I guess a few people know was at that time when the board was changing its responsibility, the name of Board of Patent Appeals and Interferences no longer fit. So a new name had to be determined. Now, the general counsel at that time was pretty adamant. He wanted to change the name to the Patent Adjudication Board. Particularly, I didn't like that name. So I had several meetings with him and convinced him to change it to the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, which was submitted to Congress and eventually became the name. The appeals at that time had skyrocketed, as Rick had mentioned and Bruce had mentioned. It was taking 39 months to get a decision out of the board for appeals. Through a 7-point plan, which was implemented, started at 5 years, but took 7 years anyway. The pendency of appeals reduced to less than 6 months, and in reality, it was 4.2 months. And that basis, because the board of what it has accomplished in interferences and what it has accomplished in appeals, I thought the recognition was required. So I actually, with Bruce, proposed a gold medal, Department of Commerce gold medal, and we wrote up the support, and it was awarded by the Department of Commerce to the board. I don't know, I believe that was the only gold medal the board had. I actually received it in behalf of the board and walked it back to the patent office and hammered it on the wall right outside the hearing rooms. So I don't know where it is now, but that's where it was.
You know, it was interesting. The statistics when I retired, as I chatted with Rick and Gary the other day about this, I went outside the chain of command and around the general counsel to inform then director James Rogan immediately on October 1st, 2003, how well we had done. Well, Gary had got it even further by the time the rest of us went in, but we reduced the number of appeals from nearly 9,500 in February of 1998 down to about 1,960 by the end of fiscal year 2003. Excuse me, 2002. We reduced the number of pending interferences to 107, which was down from 433. And the interference trial section was organized on October 1st, 1998. So it gives you a picture of how in that 5-year period, the number went down dramatically. We reduced the percentage of interferences pending more than 2 years from the date of declaration from 56% on October 1st, 1999 to less than 18% in 2003. And the average pendency of pending interferences dropped from 2.9 years on October 1st, 1999 to 1.9 years at that point. And those were really big deals. We had that strategic plan that Gary was really supervising and making sure we all held our feet to the fire to see that those numbers got accomplished. And we didn't focus on this too much, but for, as Rick said, for the first 2-3 years, there were 3 supervisors, managers at the board, Rick, Gary, and myself. And then after that, it was just Gary and I, and there was a desire to have as few performance appraisals go outside the board as possible. So, you know, Gary ended up being the reviewing official for everybody at the board. And I mean, that was a horrendous thing. The month of October, Gary looked harried and harassed every year. We'd get to November, and it was kind of like he could finally relax a little bit and turn his attention to some other thing. I had it relatively easy. I had the senior administrative patent judge, which included Fred, and yes, Harry McCandless had that title as well, and Gary to do, and then that saved a whole bunch of appraisals from having to go outside the office. But that was an interesting thing. We did not have a big management superstructure. I think on the support side, there were 4 clerical supervisors. I think it was that's all there were at that time. So for that 100 people, we had 6 supervisors, and Gary did most of them. So that's an eternal debt of gratitude, especially in those later years, for that. One of the things that we had talked about when we spoke the other day was how we got to be vice chief. Because that was kind of an interesting set of circumstances. Ian Calvert, who had been the vice chief under Saul, and then he became vice chief under Fred. But by mid-1995, Ian had determined that he would like to step back from supervisory responsibility. And so when he did, Fred put out a request to the APJ, who were at the board at that time, to determine who, if any of us, were interested in taking on a management role. The story goes, and Rick and Gary can confirm or deny this if they choose, but the story goes that the only person who raised his hand was Stoner. And so, it was kind of like, well, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. And he prevailed on Rick and Gary because they figured that this Stoner guy is probably, who knows whether or not this is going to work. He prevailed on 2 people he knew who had some supervisory experience to also raise their hands, and so their hands were helped into the air. And so at that point, he had 3 of us. He talked with us about this kind of stuff, and at some point in maybe March, April, before Ian was getting ready to go out the management door and into the APJ door, we all sat down. The 5 of us sat down and kind of tried to figure out what it was that were the actual duties and responsibilities and the day-to-day burdens of the chief and the vice chief. And then what Fred instructed us to do was to divide it into 3 files, each with about a third of the members of the board, and varying other responsibilities. And we essentially carved up everything that was on Fred's plate and Ian's plate and split it into 3 files, and the 3 of us took those things on. We should have probably known when Fred was doing that he had some other motives. But by the time we were done with that, we had all those duties carved up into 3 files. So I guess it shouldn't have come as a big surprise to us in September when Fred said, "Oh, by the way, I'm getting ready to go out the door, so you guys are going to have to figure out how to do this from here on." One of the things that I vividly recall but have had no success in finding, and my colleagues remember it as well, although I don't think they found it either. At some point, Fred had private meetings with each of us, and one of the things that he gave us was a document that was entitled "How to Manage Your Boss." I can't find it now. I wish I could. I've gone online. I see that there are some things that the Harvard Business Review had done in the early 80s, and whether it was an outgrowth of that or a document that he found in connection with something like that, I don't know. But I do recall vividly that this was a different concept. The notion of managing the boss. And this wasn't in the sense of manipulating the boss. It was more in terms of keeping the boss out of trouble, making sure that the boss made wise decisions. And I have to say that at that time in the PTO, that was kind of different. PTO had always had a very top-down management style, and the guys at the top knew what it was they wanted, and they decreed it, and the rest of us kind of fell in line. At least that had been my experience in the organizations I was part of. Didn't mean to say that they wouldn't listen to suggestions or take advice, but nonetheless, there was none of this notion of managing the boss, managing upwards. So I found that tremendously refreshing. I would have to say that there were very few people that I learned as much from as I did from Fred McKelvey. Fred was an inspiration. He could be intimidating. I don't think he set out to be intimidating, but I think those of us who knew both his reputation and understood all that he had done were somewhat in awe. And that remains true, I think, no matter how long we worked with him. He was a great individual to know, and he was so much more down to earth than you would have expected a person with his background and experience to have been. And he was a man who moved easily between the court and the powers that be in the patent office, and he had no problem relating to anyone. He was also the kind of person who didn't try to thrust himself into situations. I remember one time there was some arm twisting going on from the federal circuit with having some representation from the board on a planning committee meeting. Fred figured that really wasn't something that he should be doing, and he prevailed on me. And I can't remember if I was even a vice chief at that point. He was going over there and help them. And it was really a neat experience. And it was kind of like, you know, I'm not going to do that myself. We need to have some other people do these kind of things. And so it was a very positive experience, and it was, you know, it was very broadening.
Fred was very skilled at managing up, and he did it in the office. He did it with the chief judges of the federal circuit and many of the other judges. He got to know them very well, and they had the greatest respect for Fred. One thing Bruce mentioned was this concept of this position of senior administrative patent judge. And all that was a title. It was the title we gave to rehired annuitants, people who were on the board, retired and came back as a rehired annuitant. And it was sort of playing off the idea of a senior judge in the federal courts. On the vice chief administrative patent judges, there was really no position in the office of a vice chief administrative patent judge. It was sort of a title that was given to us, and along with, you know, we got passed on the authorities to do certain administrative function, and you know, we got no promotions out of it, we got no extra money out of it. Done. And now I don't know how many. I think at that time we had officially there had been two senior executive service positions at the board. I think the chief judge and the vice chief judge when they were combined, and then it was down to one when Ian left, because none of us moved into, you know, the senior executive services. We were APJs, and just APJs that were asked to carry out these administrative duties.
Yeah, I'll say that.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say that, yeah, Fred was a very, very impressive person, but he was, as Bruce said, he was very down to earth. So when I was riding with the train with him, he always showed up with this blue backpack over one shoulder, And he just down to earth guy, and we just talked. He was really easy to talk with.
When I was rooting through my memos, I found this one memo, and this speaks to the thing that Rick just mentioned. Ian stepped aside to become an APJ without management responsibilities, and at least as the statute then existed and was understood, APJs, anybody who was deciding cases, had to be in the competitive service. Saul had been SES, he retired. There had been some questions and flaps about whether or not that was possible under the statute as it existed at that time. Whether it was or it wasn't, because there was a lot of arguments that could have been made in both directions, Fred was not one to create sideshows, as he used to refer to them. There was no point in having an additional argument when you didn't have to have the argument. So no sideshows was always his watchword. Re-entered the competitive service, and Fred's memo suggested that future chairs and vice chairs will have to be members of the board in the competitive service and not be in the SES unless there's a statutory change, and he makes note of the fact that that's a policy issue with pros and cons. And to ensure the availability of an effective management team at the board, it's my intention to name administrative patent judges Stoner, Schafer, and Harkcom as vice chairs effective April 30th, 1995. But the concluding paragraph is the one that I think is most poignant for all of us. The appointments of judges Stoner, Schafer, and Harkcom do not involve any increase in salary. Darn tootin' that he did not. Brad Huther and I, with Mike Kirk's approval, there's those names again that you hear, have been discussing a proposal to provide for a salary increase for vice chairs. When that proposal is more concrete, Brad and I will discuss it with you. As you can well imagine, that concrete never hardened. So at least during our time in those positions. But this whole thing has been an exercise in interesting strolls down memory lane, because a lot of this stuff I hadn't recalled until I went back and had a look at some of these memos.
Well, I'll just add to that a little bit. As time went on and then the statutes changed, the general counsel were looking at this issue of being a supervisor and being an administrative patent judge. It was determined that that was legally incorrect under the new law. So they had to be changed to senior executive service positions. So as Bruce retired, it came a time when they decided that they had to make this switch. And they told me that from now on, it would be a senior executive position, but I had to reapply for my job that I held for about 13 years and reapply. That was interesting. So eventually I did become senior executive service, which I was until I retired.
Yeah, part of that story, I don't know if Bruce and Gary know, that in talking about Fred's ability to manage up, he also managed to work with the general counsel's office at Commerce and got them to write a memo. This was before, I think, the statutory change, but to write a memo saying that a member of the board could not be a member of the senior executive service. And that'll change things. The events overtook that, but that was just another example of Fred. He had a lot of respect from the general counsel's office, from the civil branch at the Department of Justice. He knew everybody over there. So it was just amazing the types of things that he could get done.
Well, he was very proactive. He recognized that this was going to be a problem, and he saw the contours of the problem and said, all right, well, we're going to get out ahead of it. And at least for now, we're not going to have any sideshows. And so Fred was, as I indicated, great at avoiding sideshows. We didn't have to, if we had to deal with one issue, we didn't want to have to deal with 2 to 3 at the same time. And so, you know, he did a great job of that kind of thing. But yes, managing up and laterally and in every possible direction. And his the tentacles reached out in all directions. One of the things I found, I was fortunate to be an invitee to the 57th annual honor awards. This is the matter that Gary referred to, and I think the citation there is particularly important. This was 2005 when this was awarded, and so while I'd like to take credit for at least part of this, this was carried to fruition under Gary. Reducing the pendency of patent appeals and interferences for substantially improving customer service. During the past 7 years, the board reduced the inventory of pending patent appeals by 89% and reduced its appeal pendency from 39 months to approximately 6 months. And as Gary indicated, it was even better. And reduced the inventory of pending interferences by 83%. Reduced its interference pendency from 36 months to approximately 11 months. And the achievements by the board have significantly impacted the missions of the USPTO and the department, to which I heartily concur. It was an interesting time. It was set in motion by Fred's coming to board. There were some things that Fred did that maybe made things a little more difficult in terms of getting the production out the door initially. But in the end, we ended up with a really fine staff of people, really well motivated and using processes that were working very, very well at the time, with the laws that were in place to ultimately reduce those bad backlogs to very manageable numbers. And it was because of those kind of accomplishments that the statutes were even considered to be amended to create the post-grant review processes that currently exist. Had that not been done, had we not gotten those things under control, had we not shown what we could do with interferences, it's highly unlikely that these other proceedings would have ever been contemplated by Congress. We had demonstrated what we could do, and the AIPLA and the IPO were both impressed with those accomplishments. And their executive directors and their boards of directors got behind the notion of amending the statute in the ways that it was amended in 2011, 2012 to create the system that we have now. Now, whether or not the system we have now is the final system we're going to have, or there's going to be further evolutions, or there's going to be further refinement, that's to be answered by this next generation. But for now, we laid the groundwork for what came after. And I would submit that that's largely because of Fred McElvey coming to the board in 1990.
It's 11 o'clock.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment that it was Fred that led us to that, and the reason it was substantially because of his work that we have the post-grant proceedings that we now have, which were, those procedures are modeled very much and follow very much the procedures, the new procedures that we all studied, the board established in interferences.
In addition to what Fred started, I can't emphasize enough how great it was for Bruce and Rick to carry that forward and to have the interference system change completely and leading to the new statute.
Okay, with that, I think we've given all our comments, all our thoughts that we have about our periods at the board, and so I guess we'll line this all up.